Marcus Thompson stepped out of his shiny BMW, adjusting his expensive tactical gear as he walked toward the training facility. At 28 years old, he had spent the last 3 years working as a private security consultant for wealthy clients. His resume looked impressive on paper: former college athlete, certified in multiple martial arts, and trained by some expensive private instructors who promised to teach real-world combat skills. The morning sun reflected off his brand-new tactical boots as he surveyed the group of people already gathered in the parking lot. Most of them wore simple workout clothes or old military surplus gear. Marcus smiled to himself, thinking how his professional appearance would immediately set him apart from these amateur enthusiasts. The seminar was advertised as Practical Self-Defense for Real Situations and was being held at a local community center. Marcus had signed up after hearing some colleagues talk about it, though he secretly believed he already knew everything these instructors could teach. Still, it never hurt to network and maybe pick up a certification that would look good to potential clients. As he approached the building, Marcus noticed an older man sitting quietly on a bench near the entrance. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with graying hair and wearing a plain gray t-shirt and worn jeans. His posture was relaxed, almost slouched, and he seemed to be just watching people arrive. Marcus barely glanced at him, assuming he was probably someone's grandfather waiting to pick them up later. Inside the facility, about 30 people had gathered in a large room with mats covering the floor. The group was diverse: young and old, men and women, some who looked like they had never been in a fight in their lives, others who carried themselves with quiet confidence. Marcus positioned himself near the front, wanting to make sure the instructors noticed his professional appearance and serious attitude. A woman in her 40s stepped forward to address the group. She introduced herself as Sarah Martinez, a former police officer who now taught self-defense classes. Marcus listened politely but found himself checking his phone, already thinking about how he might offer to assist with demonstrations once she realized his level of experience. Sarah began explaining the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. She talked about how stress affects the body during real confrontations, how fine motor skills deteriorate under pressure, and how simple techniques often work better than complex ones. Marcus nodded along, though privately he disagreed. His training had emphasized sophisticated techniques and combinations that could overwhelm any attacker. Then Sarah said something that caught Marcus's attention. She mentioned they had a special guest instructor joining them, someone with extensive real-world experience who would be demonstrating some advanced concepts later in the session. Marcus perked up, curious to see what kind of credentials this mystery instructor might have. The session began with basic warm-up exercises and simple escape techniques. Marcus participated but made sure everyone could see how easily these movements came to him. When Sarah demonstrated a basic wrist grab escape, Marcus executed it with exaggerated precision, adding unnecessary flourishes that he had learned in his expensive classes. During partner practice, Marcus was paired with a middle-aged accountant named Dave who seemed nervous about the whole experience. As they practiced the techniques, Marcus couldn't help but offer unsolicited advice, explaining how Dave's stance was wrong and how the technique could be more effective if modified in certain ways. "You know," Marcus said loudly enough for others to hear, "in my professional training, we learned that timing is everything in these situations. Most people panic and lose their advantage." He demonstrated his version of the technique, which was more complex and required precise timing. Sarah noticed the commotion and walked over. "That's an interesting variation, Marcus. Where did you learn that?" Marcus straightened up, pleased to have her attention. "I've been working in private security for 3 years. Trained with some of the best instructors on the East Coast. I've actually had to use these techniques in real situations protecting clients." He launched into a detailed account of his background, mentioning his certifications, his martial arts training, and his work with high-profile clients. Several other participants had stopped their practice to listen, which Marcus enjoyed. He felt like he was establishing himself as someone with genuine expertise, not just another weekend warrior playing at self-defense. Sarah listened politely and thanked him for sharing his experience. She suggested that since he had such extensive training, maybe he would be willing to help demonstrate some of the more advanced techniques they would cover later. Marcus eagerly agreed, already envisioning how he could showcase his skills to the group. As the morning progressed, Marcus continued to position himself as the unofficial assistant instructor. He offered corrections to other participants, shared stories from his professional experience, and generally made sure everyone knew that he was different from the typical seminar attendee. The old man from the bench had quietly entered the room during the session and was sitting in a chair along the wall, still just observing. Marcus noticed him briefly but assumed he was probably someone's relative who had been given permission to watch. After the lunch break, Sarah called everyone back to the mats for the afternoon session. Marcus had spent the break talking to several participants about his experience in the security industry, enjoying the attention and the questions about his work. He felt confident that he had established himself as the most qualified person in the room, aside from the instructor herself. Sarah stood in the center of the mat and smiled at the group. This afternoon, we're going to work on some more advanced concepts. But first, I want to introduce our special guest instructor. She gestured toward the old man who had been quietly sitting along the wall. This is Frank Wilson. Frank served in the military for 25 years, including multiple deployments in combat zones. After his military service, he spent 15 years training law enforcement and military personnel in close-quarters combat. Marcus felt his stomach drop slightly as the elderly man stood up and walked onto the mat. Frank moved with an easy grace that Marcus hadn't noticed when he was sitting down. There was something different about the way he carried himself now, not the relaxed posture of someone waiting around, but the controlled movement of someone who was very aware of his surroundings. Frank has actual experience in situations where these techniques meant the difference between life and death, Sarah continued. He's agreed to work with us today to demonstrate some practical applications of what we've been learning. Frank nodded to the group with a slight smile. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. Thanks, Sarah. I've been watching you folks this morning, and I can see you're all taking this seriously. That's good. The thing about self-defense is that it's not really about the techniques themselves. It's about understanding when and how to use them under stress. Marcus raised his hand eagerly. Frank, I'd be happy to help with demonstrations if you need someone with some experience. I work in private security, and I've trained extensively in these areas. Frank looked at Marcus with interest. Security work, huh? That's good experience. What kind of situations have you dealt with? Marcus launched into his practice speech about protecting high-profile clients, dealing with potential threats, and his extensive training background. He mentioned specific martial arts styles, defensive tactics courses, and even name-dropped a few expensive instructors he had worked with. Frank listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When Marcus finished, Frank said, "Sounds like you've had some good training. Tell me, in all those situations protecting clients, have you ever actually had to physically engage with someone?" The question caught Marcus off guard. The truth was, most of his work involved standing around at events or walking clients to their cars. The few times there had been potential problems, they were resolved through de-escalation or by calling actual law enforcement. He had never been in a real fight in his professional capacity. Well, the presence of professional security usually deters most problems, Marcus replied, trying to sound knowledgeable. The training is more about being prepared for worst-case scenarios. Frank smiled. Right. That makes sense. Prevention is always better than reaction, but sometimes things happen anyway, and when they do, all that training has to work under pressure. He looked around the room. Who here has ever been in an actual physical confrontation? Not sparring in class, but a real situation where someone was actually trying to hurt you. A few hands went up around the room. Marcus wasn't sure if he should raise his hand or not. He had been in some scuffles in college, but nothing that really qualified as serious. Good, Frank said. Those of you who have been in real situations know that everything feels different when it's actually happening. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing changes. You get tunnel vision. And all those perfect techniques you practiced suddenly feel clumsy and awkward. He moved to the center of the mat. Marcus, since you've had professional training, why don't you come up here and help me demonstrate something? Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was his chance to show his skills in front of the entire group, but something about Frank's calm demeanor made him slightly uneasy. Still, he had confidence in his training and his physical abilities. He was younger, stronger, and had spent years learning from expensive instructors. "I want to show everyone how stress affects performance," Frank said as Marcus joined him on the mat. "Marcus, I want you to show me your best defensive technique for someone grabbing you from the front." This was perfect. Marcus had drilled this scenario hundreds of times. He demonstrated his preferred technique, a complex sequence that involved redirecting the attacker's energy, controlling their balance, and ending with a submission hold. He performed it smoothly, explaining each step to the watching group. "Very nice," Frank said. "Clean technique. Good form. You've obviously practiced that a lot." He paused and looked at Marcus thoughtfully. "Now I want to try something different. Instead of you demonstrating on me, I want you to defend against me. Don't worry, I'll go easy on you. I just want to show everyone how different it feels when the other person isn't cooperating." Marcus nodded confidently. How hard could it be? Frank was in his 60s, and while he might have been tough in his younger days, Marcus had youth and training on his side. "Ready?" Frank asked. Marcus settled into his defensive stance, the same one he had practiced countless times in his classes. He felt good, balanced, alert, ready to demonstrate his skills. Frank stepped forward casually, almost lazily, and reached out toward Marcus's shirt. What happened next was so fast that most of the watching participants didn't even see the details. One moment, Marcus was in his perfect defensive stance, ready to execute his well-practiced technique. The next moment, he was on his back on the mat, completely disoriented, staring up at the ceiling while Frank stood calmly beside him. The room was completely silent. Marcus blinked, trying to process what had just happened. He had been ready. He had seen Frank's approach, and yet somehow he was now lying on the ground without any clear memory of how he got there. Frank extended a hand to help him up. "You okay, son?" Marcus took the offered hand and got back to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment. He looked around the room and saw 30 pairs of eyes staring at him, with expressions ranging from surprise to sympathy. He had gone from being the expert to being the demonstration dummy in a matter of seconds. Frank patted Marcus gently on the shoulder as he helped steady him. "Take a breath, son. That's exactly what I wanted to show everyone." He turned to address the group while Marcus tried to regain his composure and figure out what had just happened. "What you just saw is the difference between training and experience," Frank explained in his calm voice. "Marcus has excellent technique. His form is textbook perfect. And in a controlled environment, those skills would serve him well. But what just happened illustrates something important about real confrontations." Marcus felt his face burning with humiliation. All morning he had been positioning himself as the expert, the professional, the one person in the room with real-world experience. Now he was standing there like a confused beginner, trying to understand how a man old enough to be his grandfather had put him on his back so easily. Frank continued his explanation to the fascinated audience. "In a real situation, your opponent isn't following the script you practiced. They're not grabbing you the way your training partner grabbed you. They're not moving at the speed you're used to. And most importantly, they have their own agenda and their own skills." He gestured toward Marcus, who was still trying to process the experience. Marcus was ready for the technique he had practiced against. He was prepared for someone to grab him in a specific way so he could execute his defense. "But I didn't grab him the way he expected. I created a different problem for him to solve, and his muscle memory had no answer for it." The old veteran walked around the mat as he spoke, his movements still displaying that deceptive casualness that had fooled Marcus completely. "You see, in combat, whether it's military combat, law enforcement, or civilian self-defense, the other guy gets a vote. He's not there to help you practice your techniques. He's trying to hurt you, and he's going to do whatever he thinks will work, not what you've prepared for." Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "What exactly did you do? I was ready for you. I saw you coming. But suddenly I was on the ground." Frank smiled, not unkindly. "You saw what you expected to see. Your training taught you to recognize certain attacks and respond with specific defenses. So when I approached you, Your brain categorized what I was doing based on your experience. You prepared to defend against what you thought was coming, but I wasn't doing what you thought I was doing. He demonstrated in slow motion, moving toward one of the other participants. Marcus was watching my hand, waiting for the grab he had trained against, but while his attention was focused on my hand, I was already off-balancing him with my other hand and my footwork. By the time he realized what was actually happening, he was already falling. The participant, Frank, was demonstrating with nodded, wide-eyed. Even in slow motion, Frank's movements were subtle and deceptive. It was clear that someone focused on the obvious threat would miss the real attack completely. This is why experience matters more than technique, Frank continued. I've been in situations where people were actually trying to hurt me. Not training situations, not sparring matches, but times when someone wanted to cause me real harm. Those experiences teach you things you can't learn in a classroom or a gym. Marcus felt a mix of emotions washing over him. The embarrassment was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. A genuine curiosity about what he had just experienced. Despite his bruised ego, he had to admit that what Frank had done was remarkable. "Could you show me again?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the request. "Slowly this time, so I can understand what you did?" Frank's expression brightened. "Now that's the right attitude. Understanding failure is how you improve." He moved back to the center of the mat. "Come on, let's break it down." For the next 20 minutes, Frank worked with Marcus, showing him in detail how real confrontations differ from training scenarios. He explained how experienced fighters and criminals don't attack the way training partners do. They use deception. They attack from unexpected angles, and they don't give their opponents time to settle into defensive stances. "Your training isn't worthless," Frank assured Marcus as they worked through the concepts. "Those techniques you learned are good techniques. But you need to understand their limitations. You need to know when they'll work and when they won't. More importantly, you need to develop the ability to adapt when your first plan doesn't work." As the session progressed, Marcus found himself learning more in these 20 minutes than he had in months of his expensive private instruction. Frank's teaching was different from anything he had experienced. Instead of showing perfect techniques against compliant partners, Frank demonstrated the messy, chaotic reality of actual conflict. "The hardest thing for people with formal training to accept," Frank said as the session wound down, "is that real fights don't look like training. They're awkward, they're unpredictable, and they're usually over very quickly. All those beautiful techniques you practiced work great when both people are following the rules, but in a real situation, there are no rules." When the seminar finally ended, Marcus approached Frank privately. The embarrassment had mostly faded, replaced by a genuine respect for what the old veteran had taught him. "Frank, I want to apologize for coming in here thinking I knew everything. What you showed me today was humbling, but it was also incredibly valuable." Frank shook his hand firmly. "Son, I've been doing this for a long time, and I can tell you that the people who think they know everything are the ones who stop learning. The fact that you're willing to admit when you're wrong tells me you might actually become good at this someday." As Marcus packed up his gear and walked back to his BMW, he realized that his perspective on self-defense had fundamentally changed. His expensive training hadn't been worthless, but it had been incomplete. He had learned techniques without understanding their context, practiced scenarios without experiencing real pressure, and developed confidence without earning it through genuine experience. The old man sitting on the bench had taught him more in one afternoon than 3 years of professional instruction. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes the best education comes from being proven wrong by someone who knows what they're talking about.